Well, I was at a meeting this week about building a website for somebody, and they had said that they wanted a history of the organization on the website, and I had interviewed some people and got what I needed to write up this little history, and I did that and took it just as a hard copy over there for them to look at it and read it and see if it suited them. Well, it went around the table, and of course the people who told me the history, they were quite pleased with it, and the other people that were sitting around were much younger than the people who had told me the history, and they said, "Oh, no, we can't have this." I said, "Oh, is the history not correct?" And they said, "Well, that doesn't matter. Who cares about history?" And I said, "Well, you know, you kind of have to have a foundation of your organization, and people want to know, you know, what has gone on before, and oh, no, we don't care anything about history. Nobody cares about history. Nobody talks about history. Is anybody talking out there about history, right? Nobody talks about history. They want to know what's going on right now and what's going to happen in the future. They don't care a thing in the world about history." I said, "Okay, so you don't want this history page on your website?" "No, we don't need it." No, we don't need it, or we need something else altogether." And I said, "Okay, you write it." So, but that attitude is what's wrong with the world today. You know, nobody cares about history. And who was it? George Santana said, if we do not know our history, we're doomed to repeat it.
Yep, we're on the way to doing that right now.
We're already doing it, that's right. If we can't see what happened in ancient times and know that people don't change and Satan doesn't change, then we're never going to be able to figure out what Satan's doing today. And it's their website, I'll do what they want. But, you know, I just thought, you know, as I thought about that coming home, I thought, well, you know, that's the issue, is that nobody wants to look back. They all want to look forward. If you don't have even a small basic understanding of history, then life is a total mystery. You're building all over again from the ground. You've got no foundation. You know, you have no idea what's going on if you don't have a foundation of history.
And you're doomed to repeat the same mistakes.
That's right, because you don't learn anything. We're going to look at some history again this morning, just like we did last week. And this is a fascinating, interesting history. And we'll lead right up to today, although we're not going to get that far today because there's too much.
Are we still in chapter 8 or are we?
We're in chapter 9. Did I not finish chapter 8 well enough to suit you last week?
I'll let you know.
Well, we're through with chapter 8. We're going to chapter 9, Joyce. If I didn't cover every word in chapter 8, it's just too bad. Some things you'll have to just kind of, you know, figure out yourself. Okay. This is still about the 7 trumpets, and last week we covered the first 4 of the trumpets, and we discovered from studying the Bible what the trumpets meant symbolically. I mean, they were used literally in the Old Testament to do certain things, and then in what we learned here in Revelation chapter 8, they are used symbolically, but those symbols are based on the Old Testament. So we have to look back in history in the Old Testament to figure out what the New Testament is all about. So we see that in the prophecy here, that the 7 trumpets, we have the history unfolded, revealing the principle of political and warlike events during the same period that was covered under the churches and the seals. We learned from our study that trumpets in the Bible are used to symbolize war, to announce judgment against enemies, to call God's people to prepare spiritually for his final day of reckoning. They were blown every month on the first day of the month, the new moon of the month, to warn of the coming of the Day of Atonement. On 10 days before the Day of Atonement, they were blown on Rosh Hashanah. Then on the Day of Atonement, they were blown. Every 49th year, on the Day of Jubilee, which fell on the Day of Atonement, they were blown. So they had significance within the sanctuary service of God. We also reviewed the history of the Pergamos and Thyatira churches, because those 2 churches are what led up to the need for God to begin blowing trumpets in the prophecy. We learned that in the Pergamos church there was a compromise with paganism, which caused a great falling away that was prophesied by Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We also learned that Gnostic philosophy was exalted, which is what made the daily. They took paganism and they exalted it within the church. They replaced the Bible with the traditions of men. We also learned that during the Thyatira church, based on this exalted paganism, that the papacy was established, beginning in 538. The papacy's doctrines were developed, and they were contrary to Bible truth. Persecution of God's people now came from the church rather than from pagan Rome. It switched. There was still persecution against God's people, but it switched. It was no longer from pagan Rome, it was now from papal Rome. The 7 trumpets can be divided into 3 groups. The first 4 trumpets that we studied last week tell of the fall of Western Rome. The 5th and 6th trumpet, we'll look at the 5th trumpet today, and we won't get any farther than that. I'm sorry, but we won't. The 5th and 6th trumpet depict the overthrow of Eastern Rome. The 7th reveals the collapse of all human government. I mean, you don't get to the 7th trumpet until you get to chapter 11. So it'll be a while before we get over there talking about the 7th trumpet. And actually, we're living under the time of the 7th trumpet right now. We have a review now, very quickly go through these. This is all what we learned last year. We learned that the first trumpet was Alaric and the Goths, and that in 410 he invaded and took over Rome, the city of Rome. Then we learned that the second trumpet was Genseric and the Vandals, and in 455 he assumed power of Rome. The third trumpet was Attila and the Huns, and although Attila never actually had control of Rome, the city of Rome itself, he did assist Genseric for a couple of years, but he died in 452 without ever actually conquering Rome. The fourth trumpet was Odoacer and the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, when he actually took over the last Roman emperor and placed a pagan as emperor of Rome. So there was never any really Roman emperor seated after that time in Rome. Then we also learned that with the rise of the papacy, darkness in the religious and political worlds took over, and that for 1260 years, from 538 to 1798, there was darkness. That's why they call it the Dark Ages. The 5th trumpet began to blow in 622. With the rise of Islam, it's also called the First Woe. The 6th trumpet is the spread and collapse of Islam, and we'll study that next week. Today, we want to look at and lay a foundation of why God is who He is. God's contention is that He alone is God, and that's based partly on His power to tell the end from the beginning. He knows all things. He knows what you're going to do tomorrow. He knows what you're going to do 10 years from now, if time should last that long. He knows all the things that you've ever done in the past. He is God. He said, I have declared the former things from the beginning, and they went forth out of my mouth, and I showed them, and did them suddenly, and they came to pass. I have even from the beginning declared it to thee. Before it came to pass, I showed it to thee. This is chapter 48 of Isaiah. In 47 of Isaiah, in the previous chapter of Isaiah, God is condemning Israel for turning against Him and running after all these pagan gods and taking up the prognostications of false prophets and following them and believing them, and He says, no, I'm the true God. I'm the only one that can tell you what the future is. I'm the only one that has any control over it at all. Jesus spoke along the same lines. He said, and now I have told you before it come to pass, that when it is come to pass, you might believe. So what's the purpose of prophecy? Is it so we can read what we have here in the Bible, read through Revelation and say, oh, I think it's going to be such and such, and I think that we're going to see such and such happen, so that we can make suppositions about what we think it's talking about? I see you all shaking your heads, and that's good, because no, that's not the purpose of prophecy. Prophecy is given, number one, to show us God's power over earth's events, that He knew from the beginning what was going to happen. He didn't make it happen. He just knew what was going to happen. We don't believe in predestination is in that God said it in the Bible, therefore it has to take place exactly like He said. No, what we believe in is that God knows the end from the beginning. And He can look down through history and He can say, I know what man's going to do 500 years from now. And He can write it out perfectly. That's why He can go, and in Isaiah He can say, I know who my Savior is going to be. It's going to be Cyrus. He named him 150 years before the man was ever born, and was absolutely correct. He was not named Cyrus because God said his name was Cyrus, because Cyrus didn't know who he was, and his parents didn't know who he was. He didn't know any. I mean, didn't know who